Start the recording and we will get started. Okay, looks like we are live and on, ladies and gentlemen. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Well, hold on just a second. I got to grab it first. Well, welcome everybody. I am Bonnie Kelly. I am your emotional intelligence professor for the day. For those of you who don't know what emotional intelligence is, it basically is everything to do with your emotional state and well-being. My job and objective is to help you to learn how, where, and why you are in your own way and give you the opportunity to get out of your way so you can get on with your life. We are emotional beings living in a very unemotional world. So the more that we can get a hold and a grasp on how to best manage our emotions, but also to be using those emotions to guide our behaviors is going to be a game changer for every single one of you. So whether or not you have joined our program, whether or not you're just joining us today, it doesn't matter where you're at, if you're just starting in your personal development journey or if you've been on it for decades, what you can learn is so powerful. So what I recommend everybody who's doing is to really start today off with a beginner's mind. Now, if you don't know what a beginner's mind is, what that is that it's to release any expectations of what you feel you should learn today and be open to receiving information or a gift I can give you today. So as I mentioned, my name is Bonnie Kelly. I am an emotional intelligence speaker, author, and coach. I'm also the founder of the Over It Academy. It's your place to learn everything under the sun of personal development to truly master thyself and to end the cycle of self-sabotage. If you want to learn more about that, it's pretty easy to find me at bonniekelly.me, and that's BONNIEKELLL. Wait, those 3 L's. KELLY.me. All right, so today's March Madness topic is we're talking about boundaries. And for those who were kind of on the pre-call before the recording, what that means is that we are just learning how to set healthy versus unhealthy boundaries. I'm going to talk today about what that looks like, and I'm going to give you some tips or strategies. Usually my 3 favorite rules on asserting boundaries. So this is interactive for those of you who are live on the call today. That means if you have questions, there's a chat box. There is a place to raise your hand. There's a place for you to just interrupt. Don't hesitate to just say, hey, Bonnie, I want to understand this aspect a little bit better, or I don't understand what you're saying, or can you repeat what you're saying? And let's see, I got another person I got to mute here. Yay, we got quite a few new people that joined us. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. All right, so before we really dive into how to have healthy boundaries, let's actually talk about what boundaries are. So for those of you who don't really know or understand boundaries, this is your personal, it's personal boundaries. So we know physical boundaries, right? When people are, trespassing on our bodies or in our personal space. But where you might be failing with your boundaries is to recognize that there's also mental and emotional boundaries that need to take place as well. So personal boundaries are just like the no trespassing sign that define where you end and others begin, are determined by the amount of physical and emotional space you allow between yourself and others. Personal boundaries help you decide what types of communication, behaviors, and interactions are acceptable. Now, where this is essential, or why this is so important, guys, is that there's a big letter, or there's one word in here above all other words that is most important. It's you. Y-O-U. Okay, is that these are going to help you decide what's acceptable and unacceptable. Now, why is that so important? Well, because boundaries differ from person to person. Did you hear that? It's so important to recognize that boundaries are not a one-size-fits-all, one-shoe-fits-all, that they differ. And so when we can start to look at boundaries from this perspective, they're not going to be so rigid, cold, hard, and flat, that they're going to be more like negotiable, gray area, communication, and compassion. More often than not, we assert boundaries after we've had enough. I was talking to Elena just before the call started, and she's saying in relationships, she's a people pleaser, right? So she struggles with that, where you're constantly saying, yes, I'll do this. Yes, I'll help. When the inside you're screaming, no, no, no. Well, why do we keep saying yes? Why do we not have those boundaries? Well, if you're listening to this, I can give you a really good indicator, and this is going to be for you to do some self-exploration. There's a good chance that there's fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being abandoned, fear of being abused, fear of being not enough. There is fear that could be present as an underlying motivator. Now, if you've been joining me for all of March Madness, I'm sure you're going to have noticed that I've been talking quite a bit about fear as an underlying motivator. Well, your fear is an unrealistic, primal aspect of ourself that is always present in what we feel or in our decisions and how we act and react. And so without having the insight or the awareness of where fear is and why it's there, you're going to continue to cycle into these same routines over and over and over again. This is why it's so important to really know thyself. Now, in the introduction, I mentioned emotional intelligence. Well, emotional intelligence is truly just a mastery of thyself. You know what you feel, why you feel it, and how those feelings are affecting you and those around you. Well, when it comes to boundaries, this is no different. You have to know what's acceptable to you. Just like I said in here, is that it helps you decide. You have to know where your property lines end and begin. Now, I'm going to use the analogy for a moment of your property lines in your house because they're very distinct, right? If you're outside walking your dog and you're walking by somebody's house and your dog just squats in someone's yard and decides to do a number 2, right? We know that we're violating someone else's property, right? Because it's in their front yard. We know where their fence line is. We know where their grass begins. It's very clear cut of when we're invading someone's physical boundary. You know, a lot of times we have fences, right? We clearly know where your neighbor's yard is and where your yard is. But when it comes to emotional boundaries, when it comes to that place or that space where things are not okay for you or they're okay for you, there isn't a clearly defined line where you end and other people begin. And this is why most of you struggle in relationships with boundary lines. Because maybe what's okay for someone else really isn't okay for you. And today I'm going to talk about some examples of what that looks like. I'm going to share with you, and I would love to hear some of your examples. I mean, we have a handful of people that are on the call today. I would love to hear from you, like what are some different areas that you struggle so we can actually kind of coach you through and talk you through what that looks like. But for right now, I just want you to realize how murky, how muddy, how unclear lines are property lines between the mental and emotional boundary lines exist. One of the key aspects of boundaries, and this is going to be you knowing thyself, is to recognize that, boundaries are really based on your values. Do you know what you value? And do you know that your values differ within people and situations? Let's think about this. Do you hold the same values with your colleagues at work that you do with your spouse at home? Probably not. Now, why this is so important to recognize is because those values, especially when we're in a melting pot of personalities, are going to differ. That means that your spouse or your partner is going to have different values than you do. Here's a great example of a silly value. I value my bed being made every single morning before I leave the house. I value that, right? Like that is something for me that I like coming home. I like Anne's over there shaking her head like, yes, I get this one, right? I love that, right? My husband he seriously thinks that throw pillows are absolutely asinine, right? Like for me, my bed looks gorgeous. It has all these decorative pillows. The blankets are folded. The duvet is there. I mean, it looks stunning. And I come home and I'm like, I love my bedroom. And my husband's like, I'm not touching those things. Why do we have 15 pillows in our bed that we're not allowed to sleep on, right? I love she's laughing at this, right? But it's because that's my value. I value aesthetics. I value my home environment feeling and looking just relaxing and peaceful and sophisticated. My husband does not value that. But does that make him wrong? Does that make him bad? Does that make him, should my standard be the standard set at the house? See, this is where something that's a small value could create a big conflict. Now, when we're talking about pillows on the bed, right, that's not necessarily a deal breaker in most relationships, but I think it's really important to recognize how silly and some of these small things that can create a lot of conflict. So my husband and I actually had to have a conversation about bed making, because for me, I held an unspoken expectation that he was going to uphold the same standard I was, because that's my value. And so we had to have a conversation around that. And it really did come to this point where he just says, look, I don't value this. This is not for me, and I won't do this. And now that's him clearly putting a harder boundary down that says, look, I'm happy to make the bed, but I'm not putting 15 pillows on your bed. And this is where, for me, it's like, okay, let's compromise here. So he makes the bed and I put the throw pillows on the bed, right? And it's about finding ways to work with each other's values versus conflict arising because we have different values with one another. Now, this is great when I'm talking about at home, but this happens all the time in the work environment as well. And I'll go over an example with in a few minutes of what that looks like. Because as I mentioned earlier, is that boundaries are not just exclusive to your personal or intimate relationships. Now, your personal and intimate relationships are the ones that are going to cause you the most harm, right? The most pain, the most hurt, because we are usually more vulnerable and we have higher expectations. Okay, there's a key word there. And that's a whole nother class, right, that we can talk about is is expectations. Now, for those of you who are in the Overt Academy, which starts April 3rd, we're going to talk about expectations in month 2 as well as in month 9. So you guys are going to get a big dose of what that looks like. Next week for March Madness, we are going to be talking about, I think we're talking about emotional resiliency. There was a request for that. If we have time at the end of the month, I can talk about expectations as well. So just stay tuned. And if you guys have a request for that, we're not fixated on what we teach for March Madness. Really, a lot of these classes that we're teaching this month are just requests from you guys. So if there's something that is really pressing, something that you're struggling with, don't hesitate to throw your idea in the hat, because you never know what we're going to end up coming out with just for you. Okay, so before we move forward, we need to really talk about the difference between healthy boundaries and unhealthy boundaries. Because as I mentioned, the line is murky, right? There's no clearly defined, no trespassing line when it comes to mental and emotional boundaries. So we have to know what that looks like and how that starts to affect you mentally and emotionally. Okay, let's talk about healthy boundaries first, right? These are the ones that make us happy, and these are the ones that all of us want to learn. Healthy boundaries require self-respect and self-esteem. Go figure. So if you do struggle with asserting boundaries, there might be some room for you to really learn some self-respect or to learn, to build or enhance your self-esteem. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's really about eliminating a lot of the insecurities. Now, more people think that I have to do more, but it's really about removing more than it is doing more when it comes to your self-worth and self-esteem. We need to remove the toxicity so that way you have room to add more into it. So healthy boundaries also share personal information gradually in a mutual sharing and trusting relationship. Okay, this is huge. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, but just recently I was traveling. So I was flying across the country to go be with my dad. And there was this lady I sat next to on the airplane. And the entire time, like, she just is emotionally vomiting all over me, right? So I'm stuck in the middle chair and I have this lady next to me and she's like, bleh, and I'm like, how are you? And she took that as an opportunity to use me as her therapist. Now, she didn't even know who I was, right? She didn't know I was a coach. She didn't know what I did. But it was so interesting to see how unhealthy that boundary was for her when it was about sharing information. Like, there was so much TMI to a complete stranger that it was unsettling, right? And if you've been on the receiving end of that, you feel like you've been slimed. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember the Slimer from Ghostbusters, right? It's kind of one of those, like, you're like, gross, right? Like when somebody shares too much information too soon. So having healthy boundaries means that you understand when it's appropriate to share, when it's appropriate to kind of maybe be more reserved or to save that for a trusting environment versus sharing your stuff with everyone and anyone who's willing to listen. All right. In addition, healthy boundaries protect personal and emotional space from intrusion. So as I mentioned, that personal space, you got to really know you in that personal bubble. Like, are you a 2-foot or 3-foot talker? Now, if you don't know what that is that some people need about 3 feet space between you and them to talk, where some other people might only need 2 feet. I was just listening to somebody the other day, and he did this. I'm going to turn sideways if you guys can see me, but he did this like, okay, this is my close relationship. We're friends, and this is you, right? So he has like this arm extension, three different tiers of where personal space is okay. And so this is kind of that similar concept. Is like, where is it acceptable? Like, if you ever come to any of my classes or events, I am a hugger. Just so you know, like, I'm a hugger, which means, but I ask permission. I say, do you want a hug or a high five when you're exiting out my door? Because I know that there's a lot of people who have just met me for an hour, and they're like, okay, this is my personal space. They're like, I want, this arm distance. And so I extend my arm and we just do a little high five and they exit. And there's other people who will avoid me and go out the back door. Totally okay, right? Because I recognize that this is their personal boundaries. But then there's other people similar to myself who really want to embrace that hug. But you have to be able to read that and to know that within yourself versus forcing hugs upon everyone, which can really put them off. All right. In addition to healthy boundaries is having an equal partnership where responsibility and power are shared. That's a huge one. Now, this is most difficult when you're in intimate relationships. For those of you who don't know, I'm an A-type personality, and my husband's an A-type personality. And so you have two beta fish that live in the same house, right? Which could easily have some controversy between the two of us. But we've really had to come to this space where, because we have healthy boundaries and because we have self-respect, is that we are sharing that power. Now, in the beginning, there was a big power struggle. Okay, and power struggle is normal in relationships when you first kind of get into it, kind of figure out like who's doing what and what's okay and what's not. And a lot of times we'll shy away from that, but that's really just people trying to, a lot of times, figuring out what fits and what doesn't. But then you want to get into that balance where it is shared and it's going to be a constant conversation. I often get asked like, okay, so your husband and you, did you figure this out? And then now you guys are perfect. And I always laugh and I say, heck no. My husband and I are always in this space of like, okay, well, that didn't work. How can we make this better? But because we're equally sharing in the power, is that we're constantly seeking ways to make it better and more evolved. All right, so a few more healthy boundaries here. To be assertive, okay, Elena, be assertive. Confidently and truthfully say yes or no and be okay when others say no to you. Now, why this one is easier for people who have healthy boundaries is because you have self-respect. It goes back to that first one, all right? Now, did anybody, let me see a show of hands here. Did anybody get triggered with the word assertive? Does assertive scare anybody? Let's see, a show of hands here, being assertive, anyone? Just a couple of you, okay? So the reason why assertiveness gets a lot of people uneasy is because assertive is often associated with aggressiveness. Would you agree? So assertive equals aggressive? Well, it's not. I'm being very assertive right now. I'm asserting my opinions. I'm asserting these trainings. I'm asserting the call. But I bet you don't feel me being aggressive. Because I'm not saying like, you need to believe this, right? Like you need to think this way, right? I'm not cramming it down your throat and saying this is how you should believe. I'm giving you ideas and allowing you space, but I'm asserting basically commanding this space to be able to teach you. So assertiveness can just easily be making a request like, hey, I know that you have a really good intention here. However, when you behave this way, it really does make me uneasy. Would you be willing to do something different? So that right there is kind of a clue. I'm giving you a hint of something I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And that's following my boundary rules. And I'm going to talk about the most important boundary rules that we're going to cover today. But that is, that's me being assertive. I'm asserting what I need. I'm asserting that bothered me. I'm asserting that needs to be backed off. So that's a place that I want you guys to start to really kind of put your mindset into, is that to assert, like to have boundaries, you have to assert the boundaries, but you can do them kindly, lovingly, and respectfully. So if you're taking notes, I want you to really write that down, that assertive is kind, loving, and respectful. All right? Okay, next is separate your needs and thoughts and feelings and desires from others. Now, this is a really big one as well, okay? You have the ability to emotionally separate versus getting hooked in. I know I'm guilty just like anyone else, is that you could easily get hooked into drama or hooked into pain or just whatever chaos. And that's when we're not separating those emotions. Next is recognize that your boundaries and needs are different from others. This goes back to realizing that your boundaries are very different. That's they're based on your values, and your values are different. Also, is that empower yourself to make healthy choices and take responsibility for yourself. Now, emotional responsibility is probably one of my favorite things to talk about, because I don't care if you're only 1% at fault, 70% at fault, or 30% at fault. Whatever your percentage is that by taking emotional responsibility, you're taking ownership, which is a very healthy way of interacting with other people. And it gives them the opportunity to step up to their ownership as well. Doesn't guarantee it, but it gives them an opportunity. So if you're not familiar with owning your mental and emotional shit, I'm going to recommend that you keep stalking me, meaning that you keep watching these freebies, you keep showing up to our classes, you keep doing something to connect with us, because that's going to be the game changer for you to learn to take that. It'll shift the dynamics with people you interact with. All right. So as I mentioned, assertive does not mean aggressive. It is so important for you to disconnect those two words in your mind, that being assertive is actually a really, really constructive way of communicating. Aggressiveness is not where you're going to want to be. When you're being aggressive, that puts people on the fence and they get defensive. And this is why most people have a hard time asserting boundaries, is because we've been on the opposing end of an aggressive boundary. Right? So when we have other people who are very aggressively asserting their boundaries, it is easy for us, right, to not want to be associated with that. But aggressive and assertive are not the same word. They're not the same thing. And you can be assertive in a very loving, kind way. And that's what I'm just saying. So you insert boundaries with love and kindness, right? As I am an extremely loving person, and I will stand up for what I believe in the most loving and respectful way. I will not allow people in my life to shit all over me or the people around me, but I won't make them feel like shit for doing it. I will recognize that they just have a different value than me, and I will loving and kindly request them to stop doing that. All right, so we're moving on to unhealthy. Now, if you are kind of listening and you're here on purpose, which I believe that you are, I want you to make sure to write down where you are going to need to do some work. So as I share through these, if there's one or two that you're like, yeah, that's me, I need you to write these down, because those are going to be the one or two that you're going to want to focus some energy into transforming. All right. These are my oversharers, right? The lady that was sitting next to me on the airplane, right? Who was sharing way too much information and I was just like, oh my gosh, right? That is an oversharer. Very unhealthy way of boundaries. She was emotionally vomiting all over it. She was sliming me, right? And I'm like, gross, right? Now the other one is the people who just shut down. You shut people out, you shut down, you go numb, you don't advocate, you don't express, you don't do anything, you just tune it out. Well, that's the opposite extreme of oversharing, and is also another form of unhealthy boundary. So if that's you, you're going to have to write that down. Circle it, star it, do something. All right, so next is feeling responsible for other people's happiness. Okay, this is going to go hand in hand with some of that people pleasing. I often joke that if you are a people pleaser, you need to take yourself to people pleasing rehab. Say that 10 times fast. But people pleasing rehab, because we need to get you out of that mindset. Because again, that's all the energy is going out, out, out. You're going to burn out. You're going to get disempowered. You're going to feel depressed. It's going to manifest in so many ways of misery. And you deserve better than that. All right, next is inability to say no. Okay, so if you don't say no when people ask you to do something, you need to know what the fear is. What is the fear of rejection, abandonment, not feeling loved, being that you don't matter, offending someone? What is the fear? So you have to connect with the why you do this behavior. So that's a huge component here, guys. Why do you behave this way? Next is a weak sense of own identity, low self-esteem, or low self-worth. Now, as I mentioned, if this is you, more often we think like, well, I need to have more confidence. Well, to have more confidence, you need to remove the insecurities that prevent you from having that confidence. So remember that self-esteem and self-worth is about removing things versus adding things into your world. All right, next is that you base how you feel about yourself on how others treat you. Okay, this is a big one. Now, in addition to this is how other people treat you or other people's opinions or what they say. So you will base how you feel, and you'll also base your decisions, like how you choose to do things, based on what other people are going to perceive you as. And a lot of times what that does is that you will then start walking a path, or you'll be led in a direction in your life where it's not in alignment with your higher self. It's not in alignment with your higher good. So you will then be living a life based on what you think other people would want for you versus what you want for you. So this is a really big nugget here for you to recognize that your needs, desires, and wants matter regardless on if they're a good fit for everyone else. One of the most powerful things I say is what's right for you isn't always what's right for everyone around you. I'm going to repeat that. What's right for you isn't always what's right for everyone around you. And having healthy boundaries means that you're going to advocate or assert what's right for you, even if it's not okay for the people around you. And that means you don't base how you feel or your decisions on what other people think or treat you. All right, next we are, let me go ahead and mute this one, is a deep feeling of being disempowered, like no point in trying attitude, powerlessness. This is a big one here for us to want to, to be able to start working on. So if that's you, I want you to star, or well, I think I just got somebody else that joined us. I'm going to mute. Hold on. Which is great. I'm so excited everybody is joining us. There we go. Okay. All right, and last, you follow, you allow others to make decisions. I said that one. You do not take responsibility for your life. You blame and complain without looking for solutions. Is this you? Are you a blamer and a complainer? Come on, guys, you got to own up. Remember when I said emotional responsibility means that you need to own up. Are you the type of person that typically is just going to kind of like say, well, this other person does this, or, that it's their fault of why you behave or think this way? So important for you to start to recognize that. Okay. So hopefully you got that. If you're looking at the screen, this is probably my favorite slide in the world. It says, when you're emotionally vomiting all over people, you are not using healthy boundaries. Okay, so this is my little sense of humor. I see some people giggling. And it really is important to recognize that. Like when you are just emotionally like, all over everyone you come in contact with, just like the lady on the airplane, right? She just was just like, oh my gosh. And maybe she just needed to vent. Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe I caught her on a bad day. Maybe she's not like that. However, in that moment, she was not practicing her healthy boundaries. And she just told me her whole life story within an hour of what, everything was wrong, and the blaming of like what other people did. And, what was interesting is that as a coach, right, that it's my responsibility to typically challenge people. However, it's not my responsibility to challenge people who don't ask to be challenged. So in that particular situation, that was really just someone who was just oversharing and was emotionally vomiting all over me. Now, the good news is that it wasn't emotionally affecting me, so I was listening. And the reason why I was listening was because I really was trying to, be honest, is kind of psychoanalyze what the hell was going on with this lady, right? It was more my curiosity. Now, if it was affecting me negatively, this is a key point in boundaries, meaning that if she's vomiting all over me and I feel myself getting drained, depleted, feeling sad, getting aggravated, it's starting to affect. Now, if that happens, that's where it's my cue to lovingly, kindly, and unemotionally assert a healthy boundary to get this woman off of me. Does that make sense? Because it wasn't affecting me. I chose to allow it. There's the key component there. I was consciously aware that this woman was vomiting, and I was choosing to allow it because I was listening. I chose to be in service in that moment and just listen, even though she did not ask for guidance, advice, opinions. She didn't want any help with this. But for me, it was fascinating. I was interested to figure out, wonder why this woman hasn't done something about this. So you have to know your intent, right? And as I mentioned, if I was just in a state where that was just too much for me, then it was my responsibility to do something about it. Okay. I drank some water here. Let's see if I can get my screen to go to the next slide. Okay. So to have healthy boundaries, as I mentioned, you really need to know your values. So one of the things that I'm going to recommend for you guys to do is to really identify your top 5 values. Now, if you need help knowing what different values are, if you just go online and you Google, I'd be happy to send you my value assessment if you want it. You can just put a comment in here that just says me, or send me the value assessment. If you didn't sign up, well, hi, Anne, you'll get it. Don't worry about it. You're in the program. You'll get it. But if you're listening to this and if you're not joining us, or you're not in any of our programs, just shoot me kind of a little text message that says, give me the value assessment, or you could just go online and Google one. Either one is fine. And all it is going to do is give you a list of all the hundreds of different values that are out there. Now, what the purpose of that is just to kind of spark your ideas on what you feel is okay or not okay. Now, where it's important, as I mentioned, your values change depending on the environment. So you want to think that your top 5 values are not going to be the same at work as they are at home. So when you're assessing your values, I need you to really be to be aware of this, and to say, okay, maybe your top 5 values with your kids, top 5 values with your family, top 5 values with your husband, top 5 values with your colleagues, and really see. There's going to be some that'll kind of cross over, but just see if they vary a little bit there, because this is about knowing yourself. Now, let me give you an example of why this is important. So if you don't know your values, you're going to have conflict, period. So let's say you're working on a project and you have a team of people working on it. You value being on time over the project being done, but your colleague values the project being done over being on time. Now think about this for a moment, all right? So you are going to always show up to a meeting. So say you have a meeting scheduled every Friday at 9 a.m. So every Friday at 9 a.m., regardless of where you are in the project, you show up on time. And 9:05 comes around, your colleague's not there. 9:15 comes around and the colleague's not there. 9:30 comes around, your colleague finally shows up. But she shows up with the project being done. And then she's looking at, and you're mad because you've been sitting there for 30 minutes waiting for her. And then she's mad because you've been waiting 30 minutes and the project's not done when you could have finished it during that 30 minutes of time. So this is where the different values, knowing what you value, and so you can then communicate your values more effectively, even amongst your team. So you have to know these aspects of yourself. What I often say that in emotional intelligence is that you want to use conflict as an opportunity for growth. Hear that again. Use conflict as an opportunity for growth. This is true in your relationships. This is true in your business. This is true with your kids. This is true with your mother, okay? Is that you want to use these conflicts as opportunities. A lot of times we think of conflict as equaling bad or wrong, or that this person's horrible. We judge or we blame. This is not taking that emotional responsibility. You want to separate yourself. So back this up a bit, right? This is where healthy boundaries, where you can separate those emotions from others. Step back and start to ask yourself, all right, where's the disconnect, okay? I'm here, they're here, where's the disconnect between us? And use that conflict to bridge the gap so you can change the dynamic between you. Do you get where I'm going here? This is so important. That's a part about learning healthy boundaries, to assert healthy boundaries. All right. So as I mentioned, all boundaries are different. So I'm actually whoops. Stop sharing for just a second. So before I move on, I want to take a couple questions from people. So anybody who is listening, now you're all muted, so you have to either raise your hand or you can put it in the comment box. So tell me like what questions you have so far about healthy versus unhealthy boundaries, where that you might be stuck, where your fear is, or an example that you might have. And I will patiently wait. All right, I see Anne with her hand up. Come into my rescue. I like it. Oh, perfect. Lizzie, you're next.
All right. So you were talking about staying true to yourself versus submitting to avoid conflict.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So where do you find that balance? Where do you find what is the greater good? Is the greater good the person that needs your answer, or is the greater good to yourself?
All right, so this becomes a delicate balance, right? So when we talk about, when I was saying about not, I don't have to shove my opinions down your throat, right? Meaning that I feel so confident in what I believe that I don't need you to believe it for me to be okay with it. Now, if I want to share it, if it's an engagement where it's like, well, you know, let's say, for example, you're like, well, no, Bonnie, I believe this. And I say, okay, well, that's understandable, but have you thought about that? Right? Where I'm going to then inject mine, like, no, I don't agree with that. Okay, why? And so we can have a conversation, and then I can then start to say, well, these, you know, these are the reasons, these are the facts or statistics of why I've came to this opinion. And then if you decide, no, I still want to believe this, then that's okay. But for me, it's like, then that's that space where I'm going to allow you to have your opinion and your belief because it's a free country and you can have that, and I'm going to be okay with mine. So it's about more communicating and understanding versus like trying to force the other person to be on your side. Now, there's going to be some times during boundaries, especially in relationships, where you guys are going to be on opposing sides of each other, right? So like when you're talking about spouses or boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, whatever, you could be on the opposing sides of each other. It means it's going to be an ongoing conversation. And sometimes it's just about, all right, how can I respect you and your opinions and beliefs? And how can you respect me and my opinions and beliefs? So it's not always about like, let's agree. It's about how can we get to this level where we can just have respect for each other. Now, this can be true with religious, right? I mean, I have tons of friends who are married to people who have completely different belief systems. So one of my best friends, her husband is just diehard Catholic, and she is shaman, spiritual guru lady. Right? So like, think of the difference with these two relationships, but because they have mutual respect and understanding for each other, and they don't try to force each other's opinions upon each other, but they share in honesty and respect, that they can balance and they can have good boundaries with their own belief system that isn't always ending in conflict. But they've had lots of conflicts that they've had to learn from. Does that answer your question a little bit, Anne?
Absolutely.
Cool. You're welcome. All right, Lizzie, you are my next culprit.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. I just was in a relationship which ended, and the problem was with the boundaries. If your partner does not want to speak or is unable to talk, then it's so difficult to talk about these boundaries. Like, I know I have my boundaries, but I felt like a kind of powerlessness that I could not communicate it with my partner. And I see also that, like, when jealousy sometimes comes into the play, that also my boundaries are mixed up with things.
So jealousy is going to be stemmed from insecurity, right? So when that's present, right, that's not the best time to assert boundaries, because what's going to happen in that time is that your emotions are going to be heard and seen more than your actual need, your actual opinion. Does that make sense? So it's important to recognize, and this is going to be one of the rules. So if you're taking notes, this is one of the number one rules, is that you have to be unemotional when asserting a boundary. Have to be unemotional. If there's any emotional charge, then the boundary becomes about the emotion, and it's no longer about the conversation. Does that make sense? Then that person's going to be on defense. They're going to be guarded. They're going to be shut down. They're going to turn away. And that's when you're going to get that resistance, that wall that you're like, I don't like this. So what I often say in partnerships, now if you have one way of viewing things and the partner has a very different, is to recognize that I often say, don't give up just because the way you've tried to assert the boundary or advocated isn't getting through. We just need to find a way that does get through. So there's a million different ways that you can try to communicate your needs and desires. More often than not, we think it's just one. But where the conflict comes is because what you speak, you're speaking words, and that you think that the receiver should understand what you're speaking. But the receivers is because it's filtering through their neuroplasticity or the neural network of their mind, is that the receiving end is tuned in to a different station than the speaking end. Does that make sense? So though you're speaking the same language, he's receiving something different. So maybe you need to turn the dial on how you speak so he can receive differently.
You make totally sense.
Okay, so that's what I say first step. Now there are relationships. I'm going to be honest with you. There are relationships that people are just very grounded and they're unwilling to budge. Does that make sense? So there are going to be relationships where people are like, no, like I'm not willing to discuss this. You know,
because this is what he said. No, I cannot talk. So you will get emotional, and so no talking. And
well, that's perfect. That's a great example. Okay, so Lizzie, this is where he has experience of where he's tried to be vulnerable or authentic, and it's created emotional turmoil because your receivers were tuned into a different station than what he was speaking. So his speaking ended up hurting because it went through your receiving end. Does that make sense? So one of the things that I often say is that this happened this happened with my husband and too. I totally get this, right? My husband's like, no, I'm not going down this road, because the past experience is going down that road. It would lead to conflict. I would get confrontational. I would push him away. And I'm like, you know what? Nope, I'm not dealing with this. So I was having the emotional response to the words. So what I had to do is that I had to take emotional responsibility. And so I had to say, okay, yes, in the past, that is how I behaved. And I can't promise you that I won't go there, but I want you to know that I truly want to find a way to be able to communicate this. And I'm willing to work on finding a different way of receiving the information you're sharing. Would you be willing to experiment with me and helping us bridge the gap here? Do you hear that?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
yeah.
So that's going to then allow for a different opportunity. But that's me. I had to own, you're right. I totally acted like an asshole last time you did that, right? Like I had to own that. I said, yeah, that's my shit. And I'm willing to do this differently. Would you be willing to keep trying with me? And so then we also had, different barriers in place, Lizzie. So what I mean by that is that I said, okay, if you sense me getting emotionally triggered, or if I start sensing me get emotionally triggered, we inserted a timeout where it's just like, okay, look, I can sense that the conversation is getting aggravated. Let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break and let's come back and focus on solutions. So where in those conversations, when I started getting emotionally charged, I'd go give myself space. So then that way I could breathe and get rational again, unemotional again, and come back to that conversation again differently. Does that make sense?
Totally. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. That was a great question, Lizzie. I love that. I got to geek out on that one a little bit. All right, guys. So I want to share with you my top 3 rules, and then I'm going to give you an example. So Lizzie, would you mind muting yourself? I don't know how to mute you right here. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So if you guys are taking notes, these are going to be the top rules that I want to share with you. Now, my slides are not going to, I'm going to be skipping over some of these because some of these rules are not necessarily what I want to teach you today. Now, they're more extensive, but I want to show you the visual because I do want to share with you some examples that this visual is going to kind of help me with a little bit more. So if I jump around on the presentation, don't take offense to it. It's just because I only have a few minutes left and I want to share with you some very key points here. All right. Following these rules, though, I want to make sure you know is not going to guarantee success. All right. However, not following these rules will lead to failure. This is so important. So I'm going to just give you the top ones. Let me go back here. Well, I can go through these really quick. Why not? See, I can change on a dime. Number one, you don't make boundaries in a personal attack. You need to remove the blame and judgment. So the number one rule I have, and I'll get to this, is actually unemotional. I've been hinting at this over and over again, you guys, and it's so important for you to recognize that emotional boundaries lead to conflict. If you're emotionally triggered, charged, and that could be sad, hurt, depressed, right? You are going to have an emotional reaction, and that reaction is going to be defensiveness. It's going to be you shutting down. You're going to be stonewalling. You're going to be passive aggressive. You're going to be fill in the blank. All right? So recognizing when you are emotionally charged that you're going to be, that's what the person is going to hear more than your words. Communication is only 3% what you say. It is 97% of how you say things. So your body language and tone and the emotion behind it are more important than actually what you're saying. So if there's any emotion that's going to put the other person on the fence, right, where they're going to be defensive or guarded or protected or shut down, then you need to recognize that your emotional state is going to be causing that as well. So you have to be communicating in a way where it's removing the blame and the judgment. All right, so number one I said was unemotional. Number two is actually, this is one of the big ones, so I need you to make sure to pay attention to this, is that you need to make boundaries clear and not open to interpretation. More often than not, we are fluffy about our boundaries. What I mean by that is that we don't want to hurt the other person's feeling, and so we say things in a way that is we think is going to be not as offensive, but what ends up happening is it's not very clear, right? You want to be very specific that this behavior, that these words, that this style of doing things bothers you, period. Okay, so don't leave it up for interpretation, because if it is open for interpretation, that person's going to come back and do that again. So unemotional and clear, okay, are two of the key components here, all right? So if you're writing notes, clear and unemotional. The next one, which is actually one of the big ones as well, is kind, okay? I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to give people the benefit of the doubt when they cross your boundaries. 90% of the time, people have no idea that they've done it, and they have no idea that it's hurt you because they have different values than you. So that means that when people in a conversation are, they use vulgar language, like maybe for you that's funny and that works, and maybe for other people that doesn't. But they're not going to know that unless you're clear and kind about it. But if let's say, for example, I'm offended by vulgar language, and believe it or not, actually, I don't like vulgar language at all. But let's say we're in a conversation and all these people are joking and they're being, very rude, or in my opinion, just very vulgar, right? Well, if I said, you guys are disgusting, you should stop talking like that. Okay. Is that very kind? No. Do you hear the judgment? Yes. Are they going to be receptive? No. So in that, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, like, they just don't know that this bothers me. This is okay for them, but it's just not okay for me. What's right for me doesn't mean it has to be what's right for everyone around me. There goes that rule again. So for me, it could easily be, hey, I know that you guys are just joking and that language doesn't bother you, but it really does bother me a lot. And I know it's not your intent to offend me by any means. However, it does. Would you be willing to not use that language around me? Did you see how kind and loving and unemotional that boundary was and how clear that was? That language bothers me. It offends me. I know it's not your opinion to offend me, but it does. Do you see how easy it is to really start to start communicating this in a way that's going to be received with love and appreciation? So we said unemotional. Okay, this was the other big one. So clear, kind, unemotional. And the last one that's most important is right here. It's that you need to make boundaries a request versus a command. So these are my top rules. Clear, kind, unemotional, request versus a command. Okay? So those are the top 4 that are absolutely essential. If you remember nothing else from today, this is what I want you to remember. Clear, kind, unemotional, request versus a command. A request I mean, we typically, when asserting boundaries, they're commands. And this is why we connect asserting boundaries with aggressiveness, because the command is going to say, stop doing that, back off, stop asking me this. Why do you keep doing this? You're going to hear the judgment. You're going to hear the frustration. That's how boundaries are typically set. We've had enough, and we're trying to push that person away to protect ourselves. Well, that isn't the other person's fault per se. More often than not, you have trained that other person that behavior is okay. You've allowed it, and you haven't changed the dynamic with it. So it's not their fault that you're going to change the rules, and it's okay that you are changing the rules around this. So you want to start to get their buy-in from it, because if I request something from you and you said yes, then I'm more likely to get what I to have you honor that later on. So that's one of the biggest key takeaway for boundaries today, all right? And so this is what I want you to be thinking about as you're moving forward, because we're right at the top of our hour, is that figuring out where you have healthy boundaries and where you don't have healthy boundaries. Recognize that those boundaries are based on your values, okay? And those values are going to change from person to person, which means that we want to give people the benefit of the doubt when we're asserting boundaries. So how you do that is that you are going to need to very clearly, kindly, unemotionally request versus command. So let me give you a good example before I let you guys go today. So let's say that you're my friend and that you show up late every time we schedule lunch together. Okay, so we have lunch scheduled, you show up late every single time. First time, I'm like, yeah, whatever. Okay, that person's just late. Second time, I'm like, this is becoming a habit. Third time, it's time for me to say something. So let's say that you show up to the lunch. Now, an unhealthy boundary would be, dude, that's so disrespectful that you keep showing up late for these. Like, my time matters. Like, I matter. You should be here on time with me. Otherwise, we shouldn't set appointments. You're going to get defensive. You're going to feel it. It's going to hurt. Here's the alternative. And this is following clear, kind, unemotional request versus a command. All right? Hey, I know it's not your intent to hurt me, but every time that you show up late, it really does feel disrespectful. I know that's not what you're doing, but that is how it's being received. It's really important that we honor the time together that we set aside. Would you be willing to honor our scheduled appointment by arriving on time next time we plan lunch together? Now, if you were on the receiving end of that, you could hear that. You can see that, okay, she's not taking offense, but she still is asserting that. It's going to be a very loving way to be able to receive that. So I'm going to strongly recommend that you guys practice these techniques this week. I want you to just keep in touch with us. I see that some of you have set aside and asking for these different, it looks like there's something here. The value assessment, I'll be happy to send it to you. If you did not sign up through my website, I need you to send me your email. If you did, I will have your email in my system, okay? All right, so I'm going to stay on for about 5 more minutes answering any questions. We are right at the top of our hour, so let me see. I do have one in the chat box, but if you want to hang out with me, go ahead. If not, I thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget that if you want to learn more about me and my Over It Academy, which is still in open enrollment, that starts April 3rd, and we still have about 5 more slots available. So if you are interested in that and you want to learn more, don't hesitate to reach out. We can schedule a 20-minute one-on-one, and myself or my team will be happy to spend some time into sharing you with that. You can also find out more at bonniekelly.me/overit, or you just go onto the website and it's easily available. Okay, let me go to the chat box. It says, you mentioned 3 identities based from low self-esteem to setting boundaries. You can't say no. One doesn't say anything. Are the terms victim, victor? Steve, I'm not sure how to answer your question, Lovebug. So you mentioned, can you unmute yourself? Are you in a place to be able to ask me that question, Steve? Let me see if I can unmute you. Okay, you're unmuted. Do you have a headset? So it's not that you can't, oh yeah, okay. So one of the ways that for low self-esteem is that you don't say no. Yeah, I don't know how to answer your question, Steve. I'd be happy to. Go ahead and type it in the box, the question again. Let's see. Anne was saying, okay, perfect. Thank you, Steve. And it says, Anne says, what you allow is what will continue. Yes, exactly. So when it comes to boundaries, I mean, one of the things that I often share, and it's important to recognize, is that it's our responsibility to help train and teach people how to to connect with us. If we're not advocating, they're going to treat and connect with us based on their values. And it doesn't make it wrong, but it can create conflict. And so this is why it's so essential for us to be able to make those connections and to be making those requests and doing it in a way that's very loving and assertive, but not coming from a place of confrontation. So that's why you give the people the benefit of the doubt when it comes to asserting boundaries. All right, so next, Kelly girl, I love that. Says, do you need to use different strategies with someone who is narcissistic? Oh, I love this, Kelly. Are you on? Can you unmute yourself? I'd love to connect with you on this one.
Can you hear me?
I can. Okay. Hello.
I'm on an iPad, so I didn't know.
Yes, wonderful. Well, no worries, and welcome aboard. So I love this, and this is why I wanted to have you kind of just tune in on this one. The strategy is going to be the same across the board. However, with somebody who's narcissistic, they are going to constantly be advocating for their own stuff. And what I mean by that is that they typically won't hear you, and you're going to need to reaffirm and reassert your boundaries multiple times. Okay. So it's really about just that continuous advocation for what you need in a very loving and respectful manner, because with narcissistic people, they will get offended easy and defensive easy. And what your responsibility is to not get hooked into it when they do. Mm-hmm. All right.
They run on their emotions.
Yes, they do. So if you get hooked, you're going to feed their narcissistic behavior. So you want to really separate that and assert the boundary and say, look, I can understand that this is something you're struggling with, or I can understand why you don't like this, or I can understand, right? So it's really about recognizing that, yeah, they don't agree, and that's okay. However, this is the right decision for me. I know that you're struggling with this, but this is the right decision for me. And then removing yourself, say, okay, look, let's go ahead and take some space so we can then finish discussing this later, and giving the space or the time to allow them to process that. You'd be surprised at how many people are really accused of being narcissistic and they just don't know any better. But once you give them an opportunity to treat you better, and you can get through their thicker skulls or their harder heads, you're gonna have you'll be a force of good that could actually serve a lot of people in the world.
So I wonder if they can be, they are able to learn these skills of communication, because, my husband seems like he's been pretty one-sided for the last 27 years. So didn't know if he's able to.
Yeah, and this is what I was saying with Lizzie too, is it's about recognizing that you might not have found the right way that has really been tuned into his frequency. So what I like to think about is that when you're speaking, maybe you're tuned into 99.1, but what his receivers are tuned into is 101.5. So, right? So it's like you're speaking and it's not getting through because he's just like, and we think it's because like this person doesn't care, but it's because we're just tuned into the wrong frequency. So what I often share is I say, we need to change the way we communicate. Try this tweak, try that tweak. And as soon as you have success with one, then you're going to apply that same thing over and over again, or evaluate like, okay, how did that get through? And I oftentimes will even ask, I will say, like in a conversation, even with my husband and me, and my husband's farthest thing from a narcissist, but I would say, like, hey babe, like you really received that information well. Can you tell me what was it about how I said that you really connected with? And for him, sometimes, I mean, because he used to get easily defensive, you know, because his receivers were turned in very differently than what my speaker was turned out to, right?
Right.
And so so once I started finding a way that we were effectively communicating, I said, how did you receive that? And why was that? So he's like, well, he said, because you started it by acknowledging me. He's like, the first thing that you did was said, well, it's understandable you feel that way. And so when he feels heard, he's more likely to receive information versus staying stuck and spinning out on his same point that I'm like, yeah, I get it. Let's go on from this, right? But until I acknowledge that and reflect back to him that I hear this, I acknowledge this, I understand this, and I have a different opinion about this, he's more open to receiving the other end. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I ask one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
Just something simple is also people who are empathic. Now, is that's kind of on the other end, and that's me. So I don't know if you have also other strategies for people who, I wonder if people who are attending and get a lot from you possibly are on that more the empathic side, because the emotional intelligence sort of seems to be really helpful for somebody who is so in touch with everybody else's emotions and their own.
Right. And it gives you tools, it equips you to be able to navigate that. And that's what emotional intelligence is. It just basically is training you how to be able to navigate these differentiators within the emotional experience, which means whether it's like separating what you're feeling from others, what you're feeling from yourself. And then ultimately the primary goal is where you can begin to use those emotions as a guide to navigate your behavior. Now, most empaths, right, will become paralyzed by by other people's emotions, right? They're like, they don't know what, they're overwhelmed, they'll shut down, they don't know how to respond or react to that. Well, that's where your empathic abilities are going to be hindering you. You absolutely, Kelly, need to learn tools. You have to learn tools on how to be able to separate these things, on how to navigate them, and how to use those emotional indicators as a way to guide your communication style. And there is a very effective way that you can do that, because I'm a very empathic person. I can feel you. I can feel people, whether you're in my space or not.
Right.
But it also, I use it to better relate and connect. And that I don't ever allow it anymore to just wipe me out.
Wow. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Yeah. So study these skills. Okay. Whether or not you're joining our academy, whether or not you're just kind of stalking me for a while, like everything that I teach, I don't care if it's boundaries, forgiveness, I was going to say assertion, that's not it, expectations, right? Any of those topics, everything is under the umbrella of emotional intelligence. Okay?
Yeah, I need to get back to your classes. I've been to one over there at the coffee shop, so I've been there once.
Yes.
So, yes,
wonderful. Well, tonight I'm teaching at Brandman University if you want to come out and join me.
That sounds like fun. Great.
So tonight, I believe it's at 6 or 6:30 at Brandman in Roseville.
Okay, cool.
Cool. We'll see you later.
Okay.
All right, guys, I'm going to open up for maybe one more. Does anyone else have question or comment? Yes, boundaries allow us to manage our emotion. I love Steve put that in the chat box. Anyone else? Question or comment? Do not be shy. Okay, well, that is it. So for those of you who want to have this recording, guess what? It will be posted on Facebook later this afternoon. So if that's you and you want to rewatch this or you want to see some nuggets from that, make sure you're friends with me on social media. So then that way we can connect on that front as well. I want to thank all of you for taking your time out of your morning to connect with me on this amazing topic. I hope that you join us back again next week where we are going to be talking about emotional resiliency. Same time, same place. So we'll look forward to seeing you guys there. Until next week, mwah, keep being awesome. Gotta write this down real quick. AHRINS. Okay. Bye, guys.